Normandy, France, the 14th of July, 1944. The morning fog hung low over the hedgerows of Saint-Lô, thick enough to taste. Staff Sergeant James Redding of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion crouched beside his M3 half-track, running his hand along the hastily welded gun mount that held their 75mm M1000 897 field gun, a weapon designed in 1897, resurrected from the Great War, now pointed at the 20th century's most sophisticated killing machines. The half-track's armor, barely 3/8 of an inch thick, wouldn't stop a Luger at close range, let alone an 88mm shell. German prisoners had called these vehicles Milchwagen, milk trucks. They'd laughed. They weren't laughing anymore. 12 days earlier, his battalion had landed on Utah Beach. In those 12 days, they had destroyed 40 German tanks. Not disabled, not damaged, destroyed. 40 hulking Panthers and Mark IVs, each weighing 30 to 45 tons, each protected by armor up to 4 inches thick, each crewed by men who had conquered Europe, and they'd done it from vehicles the Wehrmacht considered suicide boxes on wheels. The M3 half-track had never been designed to kill tanks. It had been designed to carry infantry, to transport supplies, to move troops across terrain that would bog down wheeled vehicles. The International Harvester Company and White Motor Company had produced them by the tens of thousands, simple machines with simple purposes. The front half rode on conventional tires, the rear half on rubber block tracks that gave it mobility across mud, sand, and snow. Maximum armor, 12.7mm, enough to stop rifle rounds and shell fragments, nothing more. Top speed, 45 miles per hour on good roads. It was a workhorse, not a warhorse. But war has a way of transforming things. Detroit, Michigan, March 1941. 3 years before Sergeant Redding would crouch in French mud, Army ordnance officers had gathered in a Detroit warehouse, staring at a problem that kept them awake at night. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg had torn through Poland and France with terrifying efficiency, and at the heart of that efficiency were tanks, mobile, armored, devastating. American doctrine called for towed anti-tank guns, weapons that would be hauled into position by trucks, set up and fired. But towed guns were slow, vulnerable, static. The Germans moved like lightning. American planners needed thunder that could keep pace. The M3 half-track sat in the corner of that warehouse, and someone history has lost his name. Though he deserves remembrance, looked at its chassis and saw possibility. The vehicle could carry 3 tons of cargo. A 75mm gun weighed approximately 2 tons, depending on the mount. The math was crude, but it worked. Within weeks, ordnance teams at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland were welding gun mounts onto M3 chassis, creating what they officially designated the M3 gun motor carriage, or M3 GMC. The weapon they chose was itself an artifact. The French Canon de 75 Model 1897, the famous 75 that had helped save France at the Marne in 1914. The United States had built thousands under license during World War I, and now they sat in arsenals, obsolete for modern artillery but still capable of punching through armor at close range. The 75mm M1000 897 could fire a 14.5-pound projectile at 1,735 feet per second. At 500 yards, it could penetrate 50 millimeters of armor plate, enough to kill a Panzer III or Panzer IV through the side or rear, where their armor was thinnest. The improvisation was pure American pragmatism. Take what you have, make it work. Make it work now. The gun sat behind a thin gun shield, barely more than a suggestion of protection, mounted on a pedestal that allowed 60 degrees of traverse left and right but limited elevation. The crew of 5 rode exposed, standing in the open-topped compartment, vulnerable to everything from snipers to artillery fragments. 45 rounds of ammunition were stowed around the fighting compartment, each one capable of brewing the vehicle in a fireball if struck by incoming fire. It was, by any conventional measure, a terrible tank destroyer. It was also exactly what the Army needed. Tunisia, North Africa, February 1943. The M3 GMC made its combat debut in the desert. where distance and visibility created different calculations than the close hedgerow country that would later define its legend. At Kasserine Pass, American forces tasted defeat against Rommel's Afrika Korps, and the tank destroyers learned harsh lessons written in blood and burning metal. German doctrine emphasized combined arms tanks working with infantry, artillery, and air support. American tank destroyer doctrine emphasized something else entirely: speed, ambush, withdrawal, survive. Captain Raymond L. Anderson of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion watched his M3 GMCs engage a column of Panzer IVs at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. At that distance, the ancient French gun was marginally effective, and the German return fire was devastatingly accurate. Two of his vehicles burned before they could withdraw. But when darkness came, Anderson led his remaining destroyers in a night approach, positioning them on the flank of the German lager. At dawn, they opened fire at 300 yards, destroying 6 tanks in 4 minutes before racing away at 40 miles per hour, the Germans still scrambling to respond. The lesson crystallized. These weren't tanks. They weren't meant to stand and fight. They were cavalry, raiders, ghosts on tracks that appeared, killed, and vanished. The armor didn't matter if you were never where the enemy expected. The open top didn't matter if you struck from ambush and withdrew before retaliation. And the speed, that glorious, life-saving speed, mattered more than anything else. By the time North Africa fell to Allied forces in May 1943, tank destroyer doctrine had evolved into something approaching art: reconnaissance, concealment, patience, violence of action, immediate withdrawal. The M3 GMC crews became masters of terrain, reading the land like sailors read the sea, understanding that the best armor was the armor of invisibility. Fort Hood, Texas, winter 1943 to 1944. Technical Sergeant Michael Kowalski, recently rotated back from North Africa, stood before a class of fresh-faced recruits who still thought tank destroyers were supposed to act like tanks. He'd lost that illusion somewhere south of Tunis, watching his best friend burn inside an M3 that had stayed in position 30 seconds too long. "Listen carefully," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of witnessed death. "The M3 GMC has 3 speeds that matter. The first is 45 miles per hour, which is how fast you drive toward your ambush position. The second is 0 miles per hour, which is how fast you move when you're waiting for the target. The third is 50 miles per hour, which is what you somehow manage when you're running away with every German gun in France shooting at you." He walked to the blackboard and drew the profile of a Panther tank, its sloped armor elegantly lethal. Armor, up to 120 millimeters on the turret front. Your 75 millimeters gun, it bounces off like raindrops. But here, he tapped the chalk at the rear of the hull. The engine deck, maybe 40 millimeters. Here, the side armor, 50 millimeters. And here, the turret ring, the vision ports, the commander's cupola, weaknesses everywhere. If you know where to shoot, and if you can position yourself to shoot there. The training emphasized what later generations would call shoot and scoot. Tank destroyer battalions practiced rapid deployment, where vehicles would race from highway movement to combat positions in under 3 minutes. They rehearsed hasty withdrawal, learning to reverse course while still firing. Gunners bracing against the gun mount as drivers executed high-speed turns that sometimes tipped the vehicles onto 2 wheels. They studied German tactics, German habits, German predictability. Because for all their technical sophistication, the Germans were predictable. They advanced along roads because their heavy tanks consumed fuel prodigiously and couldn't afford cross-country detours. They concentrated their armor because that's what doctrine demanded. And they underestimated what they perceived as inferior equipment, because hubris is a more dangerous weakness than thin armor. Normandy, France, June 6 to July 1944. The invasion brought the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion ashore in the second wave. Their M3 GMCs waterproofed and loaded onto landing craft like cargo rather than combat vehicles. Sergeant Redding's half-track, which he'd named Chicago Lightning after his hometown, took water over the sides during the approach, and his crew bailed frantically while machine gun fire sparked off the landing craft's ramp. They drove off into 3 feet of water, the engine coughing, the bilge pumps working overtime, and somehow made it to shore. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the bocage, was terrain from a tank destroyer's nightmare. Ancient earthen berms topped with dense vegetation divided the landscape into tiny fields, each one a potential kill zone, each hedgerow a perfect ambush position. Visibility extended to yards, not miles. The roads became fatal funnels, where one disabled vehicle could trap an entire column. The Germans exploited every advantage, positioning their tanks in defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire, turning each village into a fortress. And yet the M3 GMCs thrived. On July 7, near La Haye-du-Puy, Sergeant Redding's platoon received reports of a German armored column moving south along the main road, 4 Panther tanks escorting supply vehicles. Standard doctrine called for tank destroyers to work in sections of 2 or 4 vehicles, providing mutual support. Redding's platoon leader, Lieutenant Thomas Hargrove, positioned 4 M3s in a classic L-shaped ambush. 2 vehicles covering the road from the front, 2 more hidden in a farm lane that would give them shots into the German flank. They waited 3 hours. In that time, Redding watched ants crawl across his boots and listened to the distant rumble of artillery. His loader, Private First Class Danny Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, cleaned the breech mechanism for the 4th time. The gunner, Corporal William Dutch Vandermeer, smoked cigarette after cigarette until the lieutenant's glare made him stop. The driver, Private Eddie Washington from Alabama, sat behind the wheel, ready, always ready. The Panthers appeared at 1,430 hours. Massive and intimidating, their long 75mm KWK-42 guns capable of destroying any American tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The German commander's hatch was open. Redding could see him scanning the hedgerows with binoculars, cautious but not cautious enough. The column moved at perhaps 15 miles per hour, the Panther's engines growling. Lieutenant Hargrove's voice crackled over the radio. "Wait for it. Wait for all 4. Lead vehicle reaches the barn." The lead Panther passed the barn. The second followed. The third. The fourth. Hargrove's voice. "Fire." 8 75mm rounds left 8 guns in a ragged sequence that sounded like thunder breaking loose from earth. At 200 yards, the M1897's muzzle velocity drove its projectiles through the Panther's side armor as if it were cloth. The lead tank's ammunition cooked off, the turret lifting free and tumbling into a ditch. The second Panther slewed sideways, its engine destroyed, and Redding's gunner put another round through the driver's compartment. The third Panther, the German commander desperately trying to traverse his turret toward the ambush, took 3 hits before it stopped moving. The fourth attempted to reverse, tracks churning mud, and made it perhaps 20 yards before 2 rounds struck its engine deck. From first shot to last, 45 seconds. The M3 GMCs were already moving, engines roaring, racing down farm tracks and back roads, putting distance between themselves and the inevitable German response. Artillery began falling 3 minutes later, destroying the positions they'd already abandoned. This pattern repeated itself across Normandy. The tank destroyers didn't fight fair, because fair fights got you killed. They used civilian guides who knew every farm lane and cow path. They studied German routines, noting that Panzer columns typically rested at midday, and that commanders often dismounted at crossroads to consult maps. They learned that German tanks buttoned up in combat, but kept hatches open during movement, making them vulnerable to the fragments from near-miss high-explosive rounds. By July 18, the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion had been credited with 40 confirmed tank kills, another dozen probables, and scores of half-tracks, armored cars, and trucks. Their own losses: 7 M3 GMCs destroyed, 14 men killed, 23 wounded. The mathematics were brutal but clear. For every tank destroyer lost, they'd killed nearly 6 German armored vehicles. The technical reality behind the success. The M3 gun motor carriage succeeded not despite its limitations, but, paradoxically, because of them. Modern military analysts studying the vehicle's combat record have identified several factors that transformed a makeshift conversion into an effective weapon system. First, the speed differential was decisive. A Panther tank, weighing 45 tons, could reach a top speed of 34 miles per hour on roads in theory. In practice, concerns about mechanical reliability, fuel consumption, and the need to maintain formation meant German armor typically moved at 15 to 20 miles per hour. The M3 GMC's 4-5 mile per hour capability, achieved through its relatively lightweight and powerful inline-6 gasoline engine producing 147 horsepower, gave it a 2-to-1 speed advantage. In tactical terms, this meant tank destroyers could reposition twice as fast as their opponents could react. Second, the lack of armor forced superior tactics. Tank destroyer crews couldn't afford to trade shots. They had to ensure first-round kills and immediate withdrawal. This constraint produced exceptional gunnery skills. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion's records show an average engagement range of 350 yards, with 76% first-round hit rates, extraordinary accuracy, reflecting intensive training and life-or-death motivation. Third, the open-top design, seemingly a fatal flaw, provided crucial situational awareness. Buttoned-up tank crews relied on periscopes with limited fields of view. Tank destroyer crews could see, hear, and sense their environment completely. In the close terrain of Normandy, this awareness often meant the difference between ambush and ambushed. Fourth, the 75mm M1897, ancient though it was, remained lethal at close range. The gun's horizontal sliding breech block allowed rapid reloading. A well-trained crew could sustain 15 rounds per minute. The ammunition selection included armor-piercing capped ballistic cap, APC-BC, rounds, high-explosive anti-tank, heat rounds, and standard high-explosive for engaging soft targets. Against the side armor of German medium tanks, the armor-piercing rounds were devastatingly effective. Finally, American logistics supported rapid replacement and repair. When M3 GMCs were damaged or destroyed, replacements arrived within days. When guns wore out after firing thousands of rounds, armored workshops swapped them overnight. The Germans, operating at the end of extended supply lines under constant air attack, couldn't match this regenerative capacity. The human cost of asymmetric warfare, but statistics obscure suffering, and victory isn't measured solely in destroyed tanks and captured ground. The men who crewed the M3 GMCs understood their vehicles' vulnerabilities with visceral clarity. They rode into combat in open vehicles where a single machine gun burst could kill the entire crew. They faced opponents in massive armored vehicles armed with weapons that could obliterate their thin-skinned half-tracks from ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire. The psychological burden was immense. Private First Class Chen, Sergeant Redding's loader, wrote in a letter home, "Every time we roll toward the sound of tanks, I wonder if this is the time we get it. The gun's right there, no protection, and you're standing behind it loading shells, completely exposed. When we fire, every German soldier within a mile knows exactly where we are. You learn to move fast, think fast, and pray faster." The tank destroyers also faced the moral ambiguity of their tactics. They struck from ambush, often targeting tanks that had no awareness of their presence. The first shot frequently killed the enemy commander, the man most exposed in his cupola. Subsequent shots targeted the hull, where drivers and gunners sat trapped in their metal coffins. Burning men sometimes escaped, more often they didn't. The tank destroyer crews watched through their gun sights as men died distant enough for the killing to be clinical, close enough for it to be personal. Sergeant Redding spoke of it rarely, but after the war he told an interviewer, "You remember every tank, the way it moved before you fired, the sound when your round hit, whether anyone got out. The Panthers would burn hot, this bright orange flame, and you'd see shadows moving inside for a few seconds. Then nothing. We'd already be driving away, but I'd still see it. Still do, sometimes." Evolution and obsolescence. By late 1944, the M3 GMC was being phased out in favor of more sophisticated tank destroyers. The M10 with its 3-inch gun mounted on a Sherman chassis, the M18 Hellcat with its 76mm gun and 5-mile-per-hour speed, and eventually the M36 Jackson with its powerful 90mm gun. These vehicles offered better protection, more powerful armament, and greater effectiveness against the increasingly heavy German armor appearing on the battlefield. Tigers, King Tigers, and late-model Panthers with improved armor schemes. Yet the M3 GMC soldiered on in secondary theaters, and with units that had mastered its employment. In Italy's mountainous terrain, where maneuverability mattered more than armor, M3 battalions continued to rack up kills against German armor trapped on narrow mountain roads. In the Pacific, where Japanese tanks were lighter and less numerous, the M3 GMC proved devastatingly effective during the Philippines campaign. The final recorded combat use of the M3 GMC in American service came in April 1945, in the closing weeks of the European War. By then, German armor was scarce, fuel was scarcer, and the Wehrmacht was disintegrating. The tank destroyers found themselves engaging everything from half-tracks to horse-drawn artillery. The war their crews had trained for mobile armored engagements against skilled opponents had evolved into something closer to massacre. Victory, when it came, tasted of ashes as much as triumph. The doctrine that outlived the vehicle. The M3 gun motor carriage production ended in 1943 after approximately 2,202 vehicles were manufactured, a modest number compared to the tens of thousands of Sherman tanks or M3 half-tracks produced. Yet its influence on American armor doctrine persisted far beyond its service life. The principles learned in Normandy's hedgerows, mobility over armor, ambush over engagement, speed as survival influenced tank destroyer development throughout the Cold War. The concept of rapid, lightly armored vehicles, armed with powerful anti-tank weapons, found expression in post-war designs like the M56 Scorpion and later in the Stryker mobile gun system. The emphasis on shoot and scoot tactics became fundamental doctrine for anti-armor operations, persisting into the age of wire-guided missiles and beyond. The M3 GMC's crews had proven that technological sophistication wasn't everything, that creativity and courage could overcome material disadvantage, that improvisation could defeat engineering. Sergeant James Redding returned to Chicago in October 1945, carrying memories and medals he never displayed. His M3 GMC, Chicago Lightning, had been scrapped somewhere in France, reduced to steel that might have become refrigerators or automobiles. The 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion was deactivated shortly after VE Day, its men dispersed to civilian life, its vehicles dispersed to scrap heaps and museum collections. In modern museums, the handful of surviving M3 GMCs sit behind velvet ropes, their thin armor and crude gun mounts, prompting visitors to wonder how anyone could have ridden such vehicles into combat. The vehicles appear fragile, almost quaint, artifacts from a simpler age of warfare. But those who study the combat records, who read the after-action reports and interview transcripts, understand something different. They understand that every technological solution carries limitations, that every limitation forces adaptation, and that adaptation forged by necessity sometimes produces excellence that design alone cannot achieve. The Germans called them milk trucks, a contemptuous dismissal of vehicles they considered beneath notice. But in the summer of 1944, in the hedgerows and villages of France, those milk trucks taught the Wehrmacht that scorn is a poor substitute for respect, that appearance deceives, and that American ingenuity wedded to American courage creates combinations against which even the finest engineering provides inadequate defense. 40 tanks in 1 month, destroyed by crews riding in vehicles with armor measured in fractions of an inch. It was a triumph of doctrine over design, of speed over steel, of audacity over armor. It was improvisation elevated to art form, desperation transformed into victory. It was the American way of war distilled to its essence. Take what you have, make it work, and if the enemy laughs, make them regret it. The M3 gun motor carriage never should have worked as a tank destroyer. Every logical analysis condemned it as inadequate. But in the calculus of combat, where human factors outweigh engineering specifications and where determination matters more than armor thickness, the impossible sometimes becomes inevitable. The milk trucks drank blood because their crews refused to accept limitations as destiny, because they learned that survival depends on movement, and that movement requires courage, and because they understood that the best armor isn't steel, it's speed, cunning, and the will to close with an enemy who thought himself invincible. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory. Not the tanks destroyed or the ground captured, but the proof that spirit can overcome steel, that cleverness can defeat sophistication, and that warriors armed with inferior weapons but superior determination will always find a way to make the enemy pay in blood for every inch of ground, every moment of time, every assumption of supremacy. The milk truck became a nightmare, and in doing so, it became legend.